All right, thank you, George. So my project is working on a proposal to develop a curriculum that will train practitioners in Burkina Faso in sustainable peace building practices aimed at collective healing, reconciliation, and achieving gender equality. So this curriculum is being developed for a private university, Isabel, that is considering developing a conflict transformation program. And my research that's informing the curriculum needs focuses on two primary areas: the best peace building practices and analyzing the conflict at hand. So analyzing the conflict reveals a complex web of grievances and harm that are contributing to a vicious cycle of violence. The military response to increasing extremism by the government fails to address underlying issues while perpetuating a status quo of domination. The underlying issues are complex, intertwined, and charged with generational indignations. Colonial administrations created systems of domination and social hierarchies that made for sustainable exploitation. Today, we have security structures that reflect the repressive tendencies characterized by colonial rule, which created the conditions in which governing elites are protected against violent challenges to their regime. So in order to address underlying grievances and structural issues, there needs to be a shift in the security discourse that centers people's needs for healing, justice, and reconciliation. The UN Development Program adopted the term human security in 2012, which recognizes the intrinsic link between security and development that requires equal consideration for civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. To borrow Kwesi Ning's words, human security aims at transforming individuals from conditions of exploitation and domination to that of political participation and accountability. So human security offers a conceptual space for us to think in terms of a continuum of possibilities for human development, rather than just a binary state of presence versus absence of violence. Now, while human security does call for a people-centered and context-specific response, it often fails to acknowledge the ways that girls and women experience insecurity and the particular conditions that must be met for them to be secure. A gendered approach to human security goes beyond viewing humans or people as a homogeneous group and takes into account different factors that expose an individual or group to specific security threats, including gender, ethnicity, age, class, nationality, religion, ability, and sexual orientation. Now, while researching best peacebuilding practices, the literature revealed a growing body of evidence showing that security efforts are more successful and sustainable when women are involved in decision-making for prevention, peacemaking, and post-conflict rebuilding. An analysis of 58 post-conflict states between 1980 and 2003 found that the risk of conflict relapse was near zero when women made up at least 35% of the legislature. When women were unrepresented in parliaments, the risk of relapse increased over time. In 2016, Valerie Hudson compiled the largest data on the status of women in the world to date, revealing that gender equality is a stronger predictor of a state's peacefulness than its level of democracy, religion, or GDP. The critical role of gender equality for development and security is further reflected by the Sustainable Development Goal 5, which aims to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, as well as the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was adopted in 2000 and requires conflicting parties to promote and support the equal participation and full involvement of women in all efforts to maintain and promote peace and security. So looking at this research, I'm proposing to develop a curriculum that's informed by the practices of narrative therapy and restorative justice that will enable practitioners to facilitate healing circles and the collective reauthoring of gendered narratives that oppress and exclude women from decision-making spheres. This training will go beyond developing interpersonal communication and practical mediation skills. It will include the critical dimensions of power analysis and awareness for the local patriarchal context. Narrative practice works with people to explore the stories they have about their lives and relationships, their effects, their meanings, and the context in which they have been formed and authored. And narrative therapy seeks preferred stories and counter-narratives by which individuals would like to live their lives, which can create new possibilities for living. Collectively engaging with oppressive dominant narrative presents an opportunity to advance inclusive power sharing across gendered lines. This will support the empowerment and inclusion of women in peace building and other decision-making roles, which we know is a precondition for meaningful and sustainable transformation. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ramsay. Lots to think about there. Just to start things off, let me ask perhaps an obvious, maybe not obvious question, is that in order well, let me ask first the fundamental one. What do you see particularly the role of a university in this, as opposed to other institutions within, I mean, it could be NGOs, it could be the government, it could be religious organizations. Why, what is the role with respect to all that of a university, particularly a new university?
Mm-hmm. I think other entities could provide a similar service. The appeal that I have to a university is that you provide a constant training of practitioners in this field. And then knowing the director of this university also, he does have a very Pan-African mindset, which, as opposed to like an NGO or an international organization, this will really prioritize kind of local knowledge, epistemology to inform and train young practitioners. So I think that's my appeal, is to have young practitioners be trained and have a constant supply of that. And the creation of a, database and knowledge systems that can be built on.
Yeah, very, very convincing. But can young people play this role yet, or how do they? And I guess there's a couple questions here about how do you actually, what do they actually do? I mean, how do they get started?
Mm-hmm. So there is still, we're still going to have to explore who exactly will be receiving the training. The first people that come to mind are people who already handle mediation, or people in positions of authority. And so in the communities that are most affected by the conflict currently, we have traditional customary systems in place. So we have traditional leaders and chiefs that lead. Religious leaders are big figures in mediating conflicts and things. So they would definitely be people we would hope to get involved. But I also think there's a critical role to have youth involved in as well. Since we're trying to shift narratives that kind of dictate gender roles and things, that is something that kind of has a long-term view that's being implemented in immediate needs for healing and community building. So that's why youth involvement is also critical.
A little bit chicken and egg thing. Can this start before there is peace, in a situation where there's such tension and conflict? How do you begin? Or I'm just ignorant of what's going on now in Burkina. Are there efforts underway to kind of bring around this kind of reconciliation that you all could plug into?
Mm-hmm. There certainly are, yeah. There's a few local organizations that are recording stories of people that are going through some pretty horrific violence and harm and trauma, and are reporting these stories and sharing these stories. There's plenty of people that are working on their own, and organizations that are trying to mediate and reconcile communities that have been co-living for a long time. Sorry, what was your question again?
No, it just kind of in a sense of kind of how you get this going. I mean,
right.
Where obviously you're bringing people in, you said, from who are involved in these roles, but can this process really take place if it isn't in a situation of pretty heavy conflict right now, and
right.
fear and distrust and all the rest?
Yeah. So what I wanted to add to that was that, so kind of the immediate service really that's being provided is healing through some low-cost methods that are restorative justice and narrative therapy. So these require a practitioner really to be trained in these practices. And then there's also the matter of having a safe space, right, where people can engage in these peace circles and peace negotiations, which is another component of why the university currently is a good target, because it's in a zone that is outside of conflict zones right now. And there is an opportunity for the infrastructure of the university being built to even consider spaces for hosting people for these types of processes.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is a different understanding of a university. It's very exciting. It goes beyond just the let's bring in the 17 to 22-year-olds and put them through this curriculum. So that's quite exciting. Let's see. So there's one question. So these would be people who would not already come to those who would be trained. Would not already have kind of expertise in narrative therapy and restorative justice, but you would be kind of, in a sense, introducing that. And if so, then how do you kind of get that kind of a approach, which is somewhat different, different from your usual kind of negotiation type approach to peace building? How do you get that picked up and embraced?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say that both these practices actually root from indigenous knowledge and philosophies. And they're really based on a different view of what community is and what harm and conflict are that align a lot more with, I would say, what are the collective values in the region. And so it's a lot of like storytelling and mediation of difficult conversations, which is where the training comes in. But my initial perception is that it won't be such a far-fetched concept to implement there.
So it's not like introducing this foreign concept of way you're looking at it, but really tapping into
right.
Traditional. Yeah, great, very exciting. Question here about a number of questions about the kind of the hypothesis, or I guess the data you show around gender and violence, and the lack of women in peace building. How can you tap into female kind of women leaders existing there, and are there in traditional roles or governmental roles? How do you see the roles for women in all of this?
Mm-hmm. So these processes would be like women-centered, meaning that in a peace talk or a harm circle, in these philosophies, the victim or the person who underwent harm and their needs are what is the center of the process. So by having them have their needs be the center of the process means that they get to express with the community and share with the community what the harm was that they experienced and what their needs are for that to happen. Now, how that happens will depend on the community. You can have first individual women's only circle to have the conversations built, and then men's circle on the side that are being facilitated by someone else to prepare them for the discussions that are to come, because inevitably it will always be a challenge to address privilege and get people to change that. But what is also another factor that's at play here is building on kind of pre-colonial traditions and matriarchal systems that were very prominent in this area, which you do have African feminists that write about and educators on these topics who would be key to kind of help us tap into this knowledge and making this concept less foreign and more local in a sense. But so I see that there's also questions of how it addresses gender equality. The idea is to really get people to reconsider the gender roles that they have in their society and to get people to see how harmful those are. It's happens in circles and it depends on the people and how the process is led. But it seems to me that it is important enough to pursue.
Okay, we're coming up to the end here, but let me just ask one more question. Interestingly, I mean, certainly from my experience, there's a certain number of a certain percentage of young people who in some ways reject that tradition in every society, and are kind of in the name of modernization, kind of gravitate towards different values. In your interactions with the community in Burkina Faso, do you see the youth as kind of going back to those traditional values more or less, or certainly there was a long period post-colonialization, post quote unquote independence, that there was a lot of rejection of that tradition.
Do you mean the tradition?
Traditional structures and of decision making, and the kind of hierarchy of the, because a lot of that was fairly patriarchal too, some of it,
I'm not sure I fully understood, but I guess
I think the question is kind of really where do you see that the youth of Africa, we'll take it for now, could be anywhere, embrace those kind of traditional values, those traditional structures that have been kind of buried during the colonial and immediate post-colonial period, as a way of validly, kind of solving their issues in their environment and in their culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely have a wide range of views on these traditional structures. We have local movements fighting for gender equality, fighting for decolonization. So, I mean, these movements are happening on the ground, and so I'm definitely not trying to bring in something new here. I'm just trying to bring in a tool that I found could be practical and tap into these movements, because they'd be the providers of knowledge and all that. So it's a collective effort from this point on. I don't think this is a concept that would be rejected. I actually think the opposite, that it would be accepted and embraced.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Again, lots of interesting questions